a professor of history at Oklahoma State University and a former working musician. Douglas Miller specializes in 20th century Native American history. He is the author of Indians on the Move, Native American Mobility and Urbanization in the 20th Century, and this book. He lives in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Welcome to Tsunami Books, Doug.
Steve, I feel like I should have had an introduction for you. I apologize. I feel derelict now. I should have a bio on you. It's a great pleasure to conduct this conversation with you, indeed. And it's an honor to be up here with you as well, Steve. When I first began, well, I'd say before I began working on this book about Jesse Davis, I was just kind of fishing around and seeing what's out there, which is kind of a whole big conversation that maybe we'll get into further. But one thing that I found was your really great published article in the American Indian Quarterly. And I kind of sat up when I read that. You know, at the expense of flattering you, Steve, but you've already heard this, so it's I kind of sat up and thought, here's something that has some real depth to it and has some real thought behind it. And, you know, at the expense of insulting, you know, anybody else who had written about Jesse a little, I kind of felt like this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for somebody who has something interesting to say that isn't just sort of Jesse Davis played with Bob Dylan and then he, you know, dies from addiction. The end. And I was just so taken with your piece, and it was something that really motivated me in the early stages to see if I could do a book on Jesse Davis. So thank you, Steve.
Am I bright red?
Well, I could go on, if not yet. Yeah.
Well, and I wish that this book had been out I wish I had a time machine when I did my master's. It was a thesis, or is it a dissertation? They call them, I did it in Ireland, so they call their master's dissertations and the PhDs a thesis. So it's backwards. But yeah, I wish I could take this book back with me, because it's what I wanted all along, you know? I wanted to know this story so badly about this person.
Am I bright red here? Steve, were you a fan? Were you a fan of his music first for some time, and you wanted to know, well, who is this guy anyway?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And for me, it started 25 years ago. And I was in Peter Nazareth's class at the University of Iowa. I was an undergraduate. Peter Nazareth taught the first college course on Elvis Presley in the world. And he got a lot of media attention for this in the early 90s. Keith Morrison of Dateline fame came and profiled him for the Today Show. It's a very funny news story to see Dateline Keith, you know, talk about this guy. Peter's an interesting person. He was working his whole life, post-colonial writer. He was born in Uganda, but he's Goan. So he is of the part of India that was colonized by the Portuguese in 1610, and then a diaspora. So Peter's Goan, so he's Indian, but he's not Indian. And he grows up in Africa, so he's African, but he's not African. And he started listening to Elvis Presley in 1957 when his aunt lent him money to buy his first LP. And then Idi Amin comes along, takes over Uganda. Peter and his family, well, Idi Amin expelled all Asians from the country. And so all Asians left in trauma from Uganda in the early 70s. And Peter and his family first went to Yale, and then they ended up at the University of Iowa. So fast forward to early 1990s, he starts teaching the first class on Elvis. I show up in 2000, you know, this kid from Des Moines, and just fell in love with Peter Nazareth as well as Elvis. He played, what he did in this class, Elvis's Anthology, he would play music by Elvis and then about Elvis and show, he really was teaching us how to listen. And he played for us Baby Boom Che, off AKA Graffiti Man.
Wow.
John Trudell and Jesse Ed's project in the 80s. And that's when I became aware of Jesse Ed Davis. It was that moment. And then listened, and then when I went off to grad school, I think it was 2011, I did my master's on his lyrics. So the origin story is there. To bring it kind of full circle, though, I sent Peter the book, and he's read it 3 times.
Oh, wow.
And he loves it.
Wow,
so,
that's wonderful.
Yeah. So Peter's a big fan of you.
That's great. That's great that you could bring it full circle like that. I didn't know that you're from Iowa, or maybe I did. I grew up about 50 miles east of Iowa City in a place called Moline, Illinois, just across the Mississippi River. And when my friends and I got our driver's license, we went over to Iowa City all the time because that was the nearest place you could go to get cool records and cool books and cool clothing and all the stuff that we couldn't really find around Davenport, Iowa and Moline, Illinois. So that's a neat connection too. Elvis Presley is certainly important to Jesse Ed Davis's story. Maybe he'll come up as we get talking here. But yeah, great. And another Iowa connection. That's cool.
Yeah. I'm curious, how did you get hooked into Jesse Ed Davis? You talk about it a little bit in the book. But...
Yeah. Well, it's true. It sounds like something that, it's too good to be true for the story. But the farthest back I can go in my own memories in life, there's kind of this blurry image of being at some kind of movie theater in Germany where my dad was stationed in the army when I was very young, like 2 and 3. I don't know what else is going on there. I remember I was eating chocolate pudding for some reason. And now jump ahead to the next sort of memory that I can possibly see in my brain, but this one's much more clear and much more detailed. I remember now driving back from Tacoma, Washington, where my father was stationed at Fort Lewis, to Moline, Illinois, where I was born, on a long road trip. I remember sitting in the front seat, and I was like late 3 years old, I think, or early 4, and I guess it's the 70s, and the car seat thing wasn't as, we weren't as serious about car seats then or something, because I remember very clearly sitting in the front seat for long portions of this drive and going through my mom and dad's cassette collection. It was sort of stacked in the glove box haphazardly, and 3 cassette tapes. Like, I became enamored with them. I was like obsessed with them. This Bob Seger cassette, a Queen cassette, and Jackson Browne's first album, his solo album. We call it Saturate Before Using, with Jackson Browne, right? And it features his song Doctor My Eyes, which features Jesse Ed Davis, and perhaps his most famous, most iconic musical moment. And that was Jackson Browne's first top 10 hit. There's sort of a whole story behind that. But the point is, the farthest back I can go in my memory and form sort of a true impression, and I can see it and remember it, was listening to Jesse Ed Davis. Now, I didn't know that at the time, although as I grew in short order, I began collecting music. Like in 2nd grade, I started buying vinyl with allowance money from helping with chores and building a record collection. So over time, his name would just appear in my record collection as I would study the liner notes. I was sort of just, really enthusiastic as a young kid about reading liner notes of albums like these here. That came in handy when I worked on this book because I could read the liner notes like a road map, right? And sort of find my way through Jesse's story. I'm kind of all over the place. But one quick point is, before I could make a book about Jesse, I had to make an archive. You may know from your research, there's just not a lot out there. He didn't leave much of a paper trail. You can't go to the special collections, at University of Oregon. Let me see the Jesse Ed Davis papers. There's no such thing. The story's in the music and in people's memories too. But sometime around 2017, 2018, I was listening to Gene Clark's White Light album. Gene Clark was a singer and writer in The Byrds before he went solo. And Jesse Ed Davis produced this Gene Clark album and plays guitar all over it. And I was just up listening to this album, and I sat up and I had this idea that I wanted to know more about Jesse Ed Davis. I knew he was Native American, and I research and teach Native American history. And I thought it's odd that he's all over my record collection, and I don't really know anything about him. So I had this idea that maybe I'd do a book, but it was almost, not a joke, but I didn't know if I was serious about it. When I really started working on it in earnest, I thought maybe I could pull together a really good article for a history journal or something. Something similar to what you did, Steve, with American Indian Quarterly piece. And before I knew it, I had more material than I could fit in this book. Yeah.
Where'd you get it? Oh, the material.
The material. Well, liner notes, records, the stories and the music, of course. I conducted just over 120 interviews for the book, which provided so much material. I interviewed Jesse Ed Davis's family members, his close friends, ex-girlfriends, music collaborators, including Jackson Browne and Taj Mahal and people of that nature. And through everyone's collective memories, I was able to put together so much of the story that so few knew, to the degree that sometimes as I was interviewing people about Jesse Ed Davis, they would start kind of interviewing me. Well, what do you know about his mom and dad? I heard that they were important people, and I never, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a story, I think, like a lot of people's lives. If we conducted a biography of anybody in this room, we would find probably that everybody's life to some degree is compartmentalized. And there are people who will know a portion of someone's life, but never the whole story. And so a sort of constellation of memories ended up being a major source base for the book. And then, guitar magazines, interviews with Jesse Ed Davis that I found in archives that I don't think really anyone knew existed. Newspapers, all kinds of more traditional history sources on top of the albums and the oral histories.
Yeah, that was one thing I really admire in the book is just the weaving together of direct quotes from people you interviewed, and then also those source materials, newspapers like in Missouri and stuff that are talking. Just putting it all together. It all fits together to paint a picture of what his life was like, what he was going through, how he was perceived by others as well. I had a question about your research, because I'm a Lenin freak, or I used to be. I'm not so much anymore. But you went through the Albert Goldman archives.
I did.
And found the Jesse Ed Davis interviews with Albert Goldman. And Albert Goldman, you might remember, wrote The Lives of John Lennon, which Paul McCartney said was the second assassination of John Lennon.
Yes.
It was.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. A terrible book about Elvis Presley.
And he started. And then he died working on a book about Jim Morrison. And Peter Nazareth always said that it was. Have you ever heard God Part 2 by U2?
Yeah.
And
right.
Bono puts a curse on Albert Goldman in that song.
Is that right? I don't remember that part.
And then he died on an airplane flying to London. Goldman did. Anyway. Peter said that's an Irish curse. So I wanted to know. What are those interviews like between Goldman and Jesse Ed Davis? Are they audio interviews? Are they notes and pen? And can you talk a little bit, because there's a great video if you want to go home and watch something really funny on YouTube. Liverpool versus Albert Goldman. They have him on satellite, and all these Liverpudlians are just ripping him apart. It's very funny. What's that archive like? What was that like?
I'm glad that you asked me about. No one has asked me about this yet. This is not a question I've received yet, and it's very important. And Steve, I'm not surprised that you read the notes to the book and looked at the archival sources and so forth. Yeah. Well, right. The Albert Goldman books, controversial to say the least. You characterize them with the Paul McCartney quote to a T. So I was apprehensive about using them because I know that Albert Goldman's a problematic source. Nevertheless, back to the point that there's not much of a source base for Jesse Ed Davis out there. I had to be pretty creative in trying to find everything that I could, and I wouldn't rule out any source. I mean, anytime I could hear his voice or read his voice, it's going to be important. Indeed, just as a side note, I don't know if there's like a single quote from Jesse that doesn't appear in the book that came from my research. And part of that was motivated by the idea that there's so little out there about him. There's so few places where you can read Jesse's voice. I felt a duty and obligation to people interested in his story and fans and his family and so forth to really put it all in there. If he was talking, it's in there. So the Albert Goldman interviews are held by the Columbia University Special Collections in New York. And I had to seek permission from his surviving, I believe his sisters, if I'm remembering correctly, to see those papers and explain my project to them and get the green light from them to see them. They are a series of interviews from 1983 to 1987. And there are somewhere around a dozen total interviews comprising roughly 8 to 9 hours of Albert Goldman and Jesse Davis talking by phone. Or there are some interviews where Goldman is at Jesse's apartment in Venice, in Los Angeles, and he's just recording there with them. So they're all audio interviews, and Jesse talks a lot. Now, the idea behind the interviews was that Goldman was interviewing Jesse for his book about John Lennon. So a lot of the conversations are about John Lennon and Yoko Ono and so forth. But occasionally, Goldman would almost kind of accidentally ask Jesse something about himself. And that's where I'm like pausing, turning it up, and getting ready, like the head, here we go. And he would ask him a little bit of, tell me about your background. What was it like growing up in Oklahoma? And Goldman, I'm sorry to say, I cannot, hearing the interviews with him, he's not a likable person. The types of questions that he asked Jesse and the ways that he tried to push Jesse in certain directions, I think to get him to sort of confirm or sensationalize things that Goldman wanted to say about John Lennon is regrettable, and it's quite sad. I can tell, and I think I can tell in Jesse's voice in some of the interviews that maybe he's not super healthy at the time. And then there are other interviews with Goldman where Jesse's very sort of animated and lively sounding. And anyhow, there were sort of just enough moments where Goldman was asking Jesse something about himself or something important about Jesse's very deep bond with John Lennon. Not just their music partnership, but their deep friendship. And that was really good material for the book because I could hear Jesse's voice explaining it. There's so much more to say about that. So much so that Jesse wrote a letter to Rolling Stone that was published where he was sort of admonishing Goldman and the book. I think Jesse passed shortly after it came out. And the point is, as I understand it, Jesse had some regrets about what he told Goldman in those interviews. Okay, that's a meandering answer, but
I wanted to know all about that. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, because a chance to have 8 or 9 hours of his voice, like you said, there's just, you go lifting up rocks and there's not much there. So that's a vein right there, a rich one. So thank you for finding it, tracking it down. When I saw that in the notes at the back of the book, I was like, oh, what? It's amazing. Let's see. I was wondering if you could maybe talk just briefly about the significance of the name Washita for us, and why. And we have his song. The title of the book is one of his song titles. That's one of my favorite songs of his. And if you could just speak to that, because you do it wonderfully in the book.
Thank you. And I know that's a subject that you thought about deeply too in your research on Steve. Right, I was born on the banks of the Washita River in a Kiowa Comanche teepee. Jeff, is that right? Jeff brought us some copies of these albums, so I should take advantage of the opportunity here. This is Jesse Davis's first solo album.
And he painted that picture.
His father painted that picture. His father was also named Jesse Edwin Davis. So Jesse, the musician we're talking about, was Jesse Edwin Davis III. His father was Jesse II, and then his great-grandfather was Jesse I. There was a William Graham Davis in the interim. This is Jesse Davis's first solo album that he began working on in 1970, right after he left Taj Mahal. In May 1970, Jesse started on this album in London, working with Eric Clapton and Glenn Johns and other luminaries from the rock and roll world. And sort of the centerpiece, right, of this album is Washita Love Child, Jesse's maybe first of two autobiographical songs, the other being Red Dirt Boogie Brother. On this album, Ululu. And maybe we'll say something about that. But back to Washita Love Child. Jesse's telling the world through this song who he is and where he comes from. I was born on the banks of the Washita River in a Kiowa Comanche teepee. Daddy had a hard time, Mama made his eyes shine, and Lord, it was just us three, toughing out an existence in Oklahoma. There's a little bit of a creative license going on there. The Washita River runs through Oklahoma and sort of through Norman, Oklahoma, where Jesse was born. Jesse wasn't born in a Kiowa Comanche teepee. It's a metaphor for his Kiowa mother and his Comanche, Seminole, Muskogee, and Cheyenne father. Jesse was born in a naval hospital in Norman, Oklahoma, shortly after his father had returned from the war where he fought in the Navy in the Pacific Theater. The Washita River was the site of a terrible massacre of Cheyenne people and Cheyenne people and some Kiowa and Comanche people who sort of ran out to try to help defend their Cheyenne allies by that point. But this involved General George Armstrong Custer, who's sort of notorious, of course, in the United States and Native American history. And some of Jesse's ancestors died in that massacre in 1868, I want to say off the top of my head. I should know the year, I think 1868. And Jesse knew about the Washita massacre. So much so that on one occasion, sorry, some kind of bug in my throat. Not a bug like a sickness. On one occasion, I have a live recording of Jesse playing in Rochester, New York, and before one song he says, well, you've all heard about the Wounded Knee Massacre by now, I'm sure. And this is in 1973, the same year that the 71-day conflict between Lakota and other people at Wounded Knee in South Dakota against FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and so forth was unfolding on the nightly news. So that's what Jesse means when he says to his audience, you've all heard about Wounded Knee now, but how many of you know about the Washita massacre? And he says something like, I'm gonna bring it home, or I'm gonna take it home now, and he launches into Washita Love Child. Washita was important to Jesse Davis. He understood that as some kind of formative experience and traumatic experience that his ancestors endured, survived, and recovered from. And I think that story it's Jesse trying to tell us that that's where he comes from as a person, not just the Kiowa Comanche teepee, but that sort of survival story that his people went through. Jesse ends up calling his production company Washita Productions. So the aforementioned Gene Clark album and Roger Tillotson and Southwind, these other bands that he produced, says Washita Productions. And his letterhead says Washita Productions. And right up until Jesse passed in 1988, he was still using his Washita letterhead, even though the Washita Productions was essentially defunct by that point, just as some kind of gesture to how important that word was for him. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That's great. One of the things that comes out in the book is this astonishing roster of the people he's related to who came before him, just in recent memory, but from the 1800s forward even, and just how many incredible human beings excelling in all kinds of different sports, all over
Yeah.
the place. So laying the groundwork, and you say in there, he came from a family that was kind of like royalty in their own community, which is great to understand, important, I think, for us to understand.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about that because in relation to something else about Jesse that comes up again and again, which is his seeming reluctance to self-promote or come forward, or you know what I'm talking about?
Sure.
Where does that come into his story?
Well, Jesse's ancestor stories are extraordinary. So many of them could sustain books of their own. He was a direct ancestor of very prominent people in Cheyenne, Kiowa, Comanche, Seminole, and Muskogee history, both men and women on sort of every branch of his family. His great-grandmother, Alice Brown Davis, was the first female chief of the Seminole Nation and ran a very prominent trading post and ranch and post office and was sort of a major figure in Oklahoma history and Seminole history. His Kiowa grandfather, Jasper Sonke, was chief of the Kiowa Nation during the Great Depression. He was the first Native American person to be a U.S. Marshal. He was a school administrator. He was a church official. He was a game warden. He was like this really incredible person. There should be a book about him. And I almost I almost wondered, like, am I accidentally going to write a book about Jasper Sonke? There's so much of him in the first chapter. Jesse's Seminole grandfather, William Graham Davis, worked in Hollywood and was a major set designer and prop maker on a bunch of famous films. I could go on and on. His Kiowa cousin, Pascal Poulaw, is the most decorated veteran in American military history. Like, these are Jesse's family members, his direct family members, and there's more. His family included medicine people, tribal historians, members of the Warrior Society, Black Leggings Kiowa people, and so forth and so forth. I think that had something to do with maybe Jesse being a little reluctant sometimes to sort of push forward too hard. On one hand, I suggest in the book that he had to be very intimidated by the example that his forebears had established. And I kind of know that because he would tell people that on occasion. He was very intimidated by his father. Lord, I didn't even say, his mother, Vivian Sonke, was the first Kiowa woman to ever earn a bachelor's degree at the University of Oklahoma. His father was a prominent painter, an award-winning painter whose work showed all around the world, and a World War II veteran, and so forth. He was very intimidated by his father. His father was also a musician and a painter, and worked at Tinker Air Force Base by day, making graphics for United States weapons of war, sort of paradoxically. So on one hand, Jesse's kind of intimidated, and I think he sort of grew up in a way and in a place where he had to be careful about how hard he was going to push himself out there. That had something to do with being typically the only Native American kid in his schools growing up in Oklahoma City. He lives in a middle, almost upper-class neighborhood. His family has a reputation in the neighborhood schools in Oklahoma City, and he experiences a lot of bullying, a lot of racism for being a Native kid who stood out. And I think that explains some of his persona and how he would be careful about putting himself out there. At a very young age, Jesse Davis had to learn to protect himself. So much so that in Oklahoma City, cruising the Strip in his 55 Chevy as a teenager, that great American pastime, right, in the 1950s, Jesse was different from the other kids on the Strip because, unlike the other kids, he kept a machete underneath his driver's seat, a long machete. And if he pulled up at the stoplight and there were some kids from the rival school who were out looking for him, as they often were, he would pull it out and just wave it in the air. All his friends remember this. Very menacing. Sometimes Jesse Davis was so afraid of the bullying and kids looking to beat him up that he would just be inconsolable and crying, and he wouldn't leave his house. He was like, they're out there, they're going to get me. It's really terrible and really sad. Moreover, in many tribal communities, among many Native people, culturally, it's a virtue to not push yourself out there, to not be loud and to not boast and say, I'm great and right, and I'm super talented, and I'm the best at this, and you don't sort of push people aside and step up into the spotlight. That too may partly explain Jesse as being sometimes reluctant to really broadcast who he was. That's reflected in his playing, in his artistry, in the way that he played guitar too. Well, maybe we can talk more about that. And then at the same time, that's his first solo album cover. That's kind of a conundrum that I spent a lot of time thinking about. He didn't want to be defined as the Native American musician of the Red Power generation. He didn't want to be thought of that way. He said in his own words, he wanted to be a great musician who happened to be Native American. And then, of course, we come back to this, and there's perhaps a lot going on there. Okay, I've been talking a lot.
That's great. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the bullying that he endured, because there's another autobiographical song of his, Ching Ching China Boy, which is about how he was bullied by kids at school and who thought he was Chinese or who teased him for being Chinese. He said, I'm not Chinese, you know. And I mean, he cries for help on the song. He says, somebody, please help me. And then you get the bully's voice too. Nobody's gonna come help you.
Yeah.
More recently, my sister's a education professor at Indiana University in Bloomington, and she teaches future social studies teachers. And so she asked me once, she was like, can, from Jesse and Davis's songbook, is there anything I should play for them? Because I like to open each class with a song. So I said, we'll do that one. And she said she does it every year. And it makes the kids really uncomfortable. Kids, they're college students. It makes the students really uncomfortable, but they talk through it and sort of to get to it. At first they don't know what they're listening to, you know.
And if you just see the title.
Exactly. It's a slur.
It's a slur, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what the kids were calling him.
Exactly.
As you noted, right.
Yeah. So, and that's on his third solo album, Keep Me Coming.
Right.
And how old, he's in his 30s when he does that, probably. I don't
73
know. Or
44, so he's 29.
29,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And so here he is, singing about this on his third album, a song he's written himself. That left a mark.
Left a mark,
right? Yeah.
It's interesting. What I ultimately arrive at isn't, especially profound, but it's, I think, perhaps the best way to, not the right way, but the best way to think about it is that Jesse was proud to be Native American. He was proud to be Kiowa. As much as we like to think that music is the great equalizer and that it's a space where race and ethnicity and gender and these things don't matter, that's wishful thinking, I think, for the most part. I think at times, even in the recording industry, where people might be more enlightened or more hip, he would still be confronted with, if not sort of virulent racism, at least kind of stereotypes and sort of misplaced expectations for who he was and where he came from and how he grew up. And some of the people he's palling around with, John Lennon and folks like that, like all they knew about Native American people might be from what they saw in the same John Wayne Western films that kids in England would watch, just like kids growing up in the United States. So I think Jesse, kind of these close friends, he probably had to have the burden of sort of teaching them, that's a stereotype. In fact, there's some explicit examples of that in the book. Moreover, to some people, once he gets out to California in 1967 and he's finding his way into the Hollywood music business, he's not just exotic to some people out there because he's Native American. It's also because he's an Okie. He's from Oklahoma, which has its own sort of system of connotations and stereotypes and assumptions and expectations. And there's a long history of Okies going to California, right, going back to the Dust Bowl crises and so forth. And Jesse, he had to carry all that too. He's not just Native. He's not just an indigenous musician. He's also an Oklahoman musician. And man, that had to be hard for him at times.
Well, and isn't that so interesting? You talk about the, Leon Russell's stable of players, and the house they're all staying in and stuff. And but I mean, they're incredible. They have their own sound. They talk about having their own sound, and so many of them are so interesting, just as people too.
Yeah.
Characters. But Roger Tillison is like musician, also works construction. Of course. And his album, Roger Tillison's album, is one of my favorites.
It's incredible.
It's an amazing, amazing song. And his work with Mark Benno, Jesse's work with Mark Benno. My favorite song is "Speak Your Mind."
Yeah.
That's my favorite one. What about? Do you have a favorite one?
Well, that Roger Tillison album I love, and I interviewed a few people who played on that, Billy Rich and Sandy Konikoff and Jim Keltner, of course, and they all love that album too. They're all like, yeah, nobody ever talks about that album. I remember after I interviewed Keltner, at the end of the conversation, he's like, all right, man, I'm gonna let you go. I'm gonna go find that Roger Tillison album and give that a spin, And yeah, Roger Tillison. I like the Old Cracked Looking Glass from that album. Roger Tillison was an Okie from Lawton who got this album deal with Atco, Jesse Davis's album, and Jesse set to produce it. They knew each other from the sort of, the Oklahoma Mafia, as they call themselves. And Roger Tillison took his recording advance and took all the money from it and rented the roof of some fancy hotel in LA and had all his friends come over, and he bought some party favors, and the next day he's just told everybody I'm going back to Oklahoma, I quit, I hate the music business. And this was his record release launch party, and he tells everybody I'm done. And he goes back to Oklahoma, and he's working on roofs and construction and stuff. Just one among the many, as you suggested, sort of larger than life characters who populated the Sky Hill studio, Leon Russell's house/home studio at the foot of the Hollywood Hills, and later a place that all the Okies are calling the Plantation, inappropriately. They're saying that they're working like slaves for the music business. Well, okay. But that's out in Sherman Oaks. And Jesse's part of this whole scene in 67, 68, 69, when he also starts playing with Taj Mahal. And Jesse's kind of a central figure among these people making the Tulsa sound, as it will become known, in Los Angeles, of all places. And I think I say in the book, or I've said to people in conversation, it couldn't have been a Tulsa sound without Jesse Davis. It couldn't have been a Tulsa sound without a Native American musician. By definition, it's not a Tulsa sound if there aren't Native people involved. So...
Was it Leon who connected him up with all that?
Yeah. Well, Levon Helm, the drummer of the band from Arkansas, who had been pals with Jesse from when Jesse played with Conway Twitty. They would go out and do gigs with Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, and then Levon and the Hawks. So this is a good question. Jesse himself said, he used to sort of joke, he had to go all the way to Los Angeles to meet all these Tulsa guys, Leon Russell, Carl Radel, and so forth, Chuck Blackwell, all these guys, who had been just down the road. Jesse's an OKC guy, and Tulsa might as well have been 1,000 miles away at that time. So he goes to LA, and Levon Helm takes him to meet Leon Russell. Yeah.
I've got one more question, then maybe we should open it up.
Sure.
When I was sort of, digging around, looking things up, and Roger Tillison comes up, and then I found out that there's quite a following in Japan for Jesse Ed. There are fans in Japan who flew Roger Tillison over for come, we want to hang out with you, basically. What can you talk a little bit? I'm curious about this following in Japan. Do you know much about the Japanese?
No, I
fan
tried to
base?
figure it out, and I've seen a couple of messages on like a YouTube video or something, like, "Hey, we're Jesse fans here in Japan. Be in touch." But like, I don't know how. I'd like to. Two things there interesting. So once, I failed to mention that a significant part of the source base came from getting to know a person named Billy Noriega, who was, for all intents and purposes, Jesse's son, not biologically. Billy was one when Jesse started dating his mother, Patty, and Jesse would raise Billy as his own son, essentially. Billy gave me his late mother's entire Jesse Davis archive, just filled with all kinds of rich material. And looking through Patty Daly, Jesse's girlfriend, Billy's mother, looking through her journal in 1979, late 1979, there's a whole entry in there about Jesse's going on tour in Japan. And like there's like the dates written in there, like this is coming up and it's like 2 weeks he's going to be in Japan. And then later at the end, like it's crossed out. And I know Jesse didn't go to Japan and play at that time. And then the day of Jesse Davis's passing in July 1988, he had just come out of a rehabilitation center getting treatment for addiction, and his graffiti band that he had formed with John Trudell, right, the great John Trudell, had a gig down at the Belly Up Tavern just north of San Diego. And it was sort of up in the air whether or not Jesse was going to go along for that gig, and they ended up going without him. I think they weren't sure he was actually going to get out of treatment that day or something, and or that he maybe wasn't going to be prepared to play. Anyway, he calls all the guys in the graffiti band, Mark Shark, Bobby Tsukamoto, John Trudell. He calls everybody, and he leaves all these voicemails. And it's like, "Hey, it's Jesse. I'm back in LA, and hey man, we're going on tour in Japan. Get ready, Graffiti Man is going to Japan." And he said this on all these voice messages. And nobody quite knew what he was talking about. But that's like the last thing that he said to his bandmates in these messages. And he had something that was coming together. He had fans in Japan, he had a serious following there, and who knows what might have been.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
What, any questions or thoughts?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a random question. When I think of Native American rock musicians in the 1970s particularly, I think of Redbone.
Oh, yeah.
Was there any kind of intersection between him and Redbone? As Redbone kind of, to me, was like, they were very much celebrated as this Native American rock band.
Yeah, Redbone, Come and Get Your Love, their big hit. We all know that tune. Who were very visibly Native American, kind of moved into that, right,
Absolutely.
and embraced that. And I was sort of on the brink of an interview with Pat Vegas from Redbone for the book, and I think he was just unwell at the time, and it kind of fell through. I know this much. I interviewed Kenny Jones, who was the drummer of the group The Faces and later The Who, and he remembered that on their tour in 1975, in which Jesse Davis was a member of The Faces with Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood, Ian McLagan, Kenny Jones, that Redbone was the support act on some of those dates. So we know that Jesse Davis knew those guys. And Pat Vegas was going to speak with me, so he had something to say about Jesse. And Kenny Jones remembered that, like, at those gigs, there were tons of Native American fans who were backstage. you know, and knew Jesse Ed Davis and knew Redbone. And I remember Kenny saying, like, I'd never seen so many American Indians at once in my life. And it was a really kind of festive scene backstage. And that a lot of Native fans wanted to meet Jesse and meet the guys in Redbone and give them gifts and so forth. And Kenny remembered that Jesse really loved that. He loved that there were these other Native artists on the bill. That's the most I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you maybe speak to how he got his start as a musician? Not like who he played with.
Sure.
But as a kid, or
Yeah.
when that happened for him, when his ears opened and his vision turned to music.
I love talking about this. In Oklahoma City, Jesse lived just across the field from a place called the Spring Lake Amusement Park. And they had the Big Dipper roller coaster, the opening instrumental track on Keep Me Coming, Big Dipper. Right? And Jesse lived so close to it that in the book I suggest perhaps, you know, if his window was open at night, he could hear the faint sounds of kids screaming on the roller coaster. Or any number of music groups playing at the band shell. You could go see Johnny Cash for 50 cents and Conway Twitty and Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks and so forth. So Jesse spent a lot of time at the amusement park. They had a swimming pool there. That's where all the kids in Oklahoma City were hanging out. He'd go see these bands play. And he was just absolutely fascinated by Robbie Robertson's guitar playing and the Hawks, among others. And he would stand right in the front row and just study Robbie's left hand. What is he doing with the frets? How is he fretting his guitar? That was part of it. Moreover, Jesse's mother, Vivian Sonke, was a pianist. She had actually performed live on the radio in Oklahoma City. Her piano teacher would be Leon Russell's piano teacher several years later. His mother taught Jesse's mother taught him how to play piano, taught him blues piano and classical piano and different styles. And Jesse's father was a drummer in a jazz group that played locally in Oklahoma City. And also sort of dabbled in other instruments. So people who remember the Davis home in Oklahoma City suggest that it was like a record store and a music instrument store all rolled into one. You went into the front room, and there's a drum set in the corner, and guitars, and banjos, and flutes, and a piano. And they also had a formidable record collection. Jesse's mom and dad both collected tons of 45s and 78s. They loved deep blues music, jazz music, country music, everything. And so Jesse grew up with those sounds in his home while the amusement park was just nearby too, and he could go see these acts live. Okay, so now for the real answer to your question. At some point, Jesse's dad bought a Martin acoustic guitar, a 0018. And while Jesse's dad was away at work at Tinker Air Force Base, Jesse would sneak his dad's guitar out of the closet. He wasn't supposed to play around with the guitar. It's his dad's very nice guitar. And Jesse would strap the guitar on and stand in front of the mirror and dance like Elvis Presley. His dream was to be Elvis. That's really where it started with him. 1959, his father, Jasper Sonke, the aforementioned chief of the Kiowa Nation, passed away. And as is cultural custom among Kiowa people, Jesse's family practiced a year of mourning for his grandfather, in which they were supposed to diminish their social activities and really spend the year focusing on the passing of Jesse's grandfather. That gave Jesse a lot of time sitting around the house, and he became just fixated on the guitar, and eventually his dad knew that he was playing it, and it was okay. And he would just sit in his bedroom for hours and hours on end, his friends and girlfriends remember, just trying to teach himself how to play guitar. So Elvis Presley, growing up in a musical home, and growing up near a really prominent place in Oklahoma City to go see live music and more. But that's kind of the root of it, I suppose. He danced at powwows when he was a kid too. He was a dancer with his father on the powwow circuit. So he heard a lot of indigenous music too, a lot of different styles of native music. And I think a lot of the powwow rhythms we can hear in some of his music, even something like Dr. My Eyes at the end. Russ Kunkel's congas and Dr. My Eyes and Jesse's guitar part over top of them has kind of a bit of a sort of powwow feel or a tribal feel to it, and more. Yeah.
What about the follow-up from that, which was the question about how he became a guitarist? So how did he hook up with Conway Twitty or whoever else, his first bands?
Yeah, he loved Conway Twitty. He would go see Conway Twitty at the Spring Lake Amusement Park, push his way to the front, and then eventually he pushed his way backstage, and then eventually he pushed his way on stage. Conway Twitty had moved to Oklahoma City and lived there for a couple of years, and this was August 1963. A bunch of Jesse's friends went to Spring Lake to see Conway Twitty, and there was like a couple thousand people here. Big crowd. Conway had already been a #1 recording artist by that time. And friends show up at this concert, and Jesse Davis is on stage. He's still called Eddie Davis at the time. He wasn't really going by Jesse yet. He's on stage, playing with Conway Twitty. And I asked his friends who remember this, like, were you surprised? And they're like, no, not really. We always kind of imagined he was going to be up there one day. So Conway Twitty, what was the question? How did he end up in the music business? In the music business. He learned a lot from Conway. So he went on the road with Conway Twitty, playing all over the country, and did that for a period of sort of 2.5 years while he was a fledgling student at the University of Oklahoma. He did not finish his degree there. He was kind of a salad D and F student. The only grade of B that Jesse ever earned at OU, he never earned an A, but he earned a B in domestic arts. I think that's so funny if you know Jesse's story. Eventually, Conway Twitty is kind of becoming disillusioned with the music scene he's a part of. He was initially, I'm sure you know, Jeff, a rockabilly artist more than, right, Hello, Darlin', and that kind of stuff. And Conway, I think, was reeling a little bit. He wasn't sure where he was going to fit in with a rapidly transforming music business and scene as the counterculture was expanding and the sound of popular music was changing. Conway Twitty was becoming a little disenchanted, and that's sort of when Jesse steps out and thinks maybe there's not a future with Conway anymore. So he hops on Route 66 and takes it as far as it goes, essentially the Santa Monica Pier. And he lives with his grandfather in Los Angeles for 1 year while he's trying to find his way into the music business. One night he's playing at the Ash Grove with some of these Tulsa friends, and a man by the name of Taj Mahal walks in, who had a tip on a hot young guitarist who's playing at the Ash Grove, and Taj needed to put together a new band. He had a deal with Columbia, but his band had fallen apart. And Taj Mahal says he walked in like within seconds. He just heard the music. He heard Jesse's guitar playing, and he knew, this is the guy. I'm going to make music with this guy. We're going to make a band. That's 1967. The rest is history. Yeah. I mean, I could go on and over. I'm sure we're over time.
Rock and Roll Circus.
Rock and Roll Circus, 68. Jesse will meet John Lennon, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, all those guys. They love Jesse already. They already know Taj Mahal. That's why Taj Mahal's there. These guys all love the Taj Mahal albums. That's going to be a real entree to sort of rock stardom for Jesse. In fact, eventually, 2 years later, he's going to leave the Taj Mahal group because all these other guys are calling. The Stones are calling, and Clapton's calling, and he's going to try his hand at a solo career with mixed results. Yeah, good questions. Thank you for the good questions.
With the, you mentioned the Palomino gig in the introduction there.
Yeah.
Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Palomino gig. February 1987, Jesse Davis with John Trudell and the Graffiti Band. That's Mark Shark, Bob Tsukamoto, Gary Ray, Jim Hanger on keyboards, are playing at the Palomino Club, which was an old country and western club. Graham Parsons used to hang out there. Merle Haggard used to play there. And they were there with Taj Mahal. So they were doing a string of concerts at this time, 87, where Graffiti Man would open, and then they would come back out and back Taj Mahal as his backing band. And in fact, that's going to happen again in Tulsa coming up on February 6th for a concert that we organized, a Jesse Davis tribute concert. That's a whole other digression, I'm sorry. And at this concert in February 1987, some famous people showed up. Bob Dylan, George Harrison, and John Fogerty were there. And Fogerty was just there because he was a Taj Mahal fan. Creedence Clearwater Revival had done gigs with Taj Mahal back in the day when Jesse was in the band. Fogerty wasn't sort of part of this this kind of gambit that Bob Dylan and George Harrison were pulling, although Fogerty will end up on stage by the end of the night. So Bob Dylan and George Harrison show up. They were there on purpose to try to generate some media enthusiasm for the graffiti ban. Bob Dylan loved John Trudell and Jesse Davis's Graffiti Man. I heard Jeff mention earlier that Dylan said in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine in 1986, the Graffiti Man album is the best album of the year. Dylan loved them, and he was trying to get the media to get hip to these guys. So they showed up, and by the end of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, George Harrison, Bob Dylan, and John Fogerty are on stage with Jesse and Taj Mahal and the graffiti guys playing some jams. Bob Dylan was pretty drunk. He couldn't remember the words to Watching the River Flow, so he kept telling George Harrison to sing it. Bob Dylan kept badgering John Fogerty to play Proud Mary because everybody thinks it's a Tina Turner song. He's got to reclaim it. And everybody kept discreetly turning Bob's amplifier down throughout the gig because
There's video of this.
It's just video of it. This very crude video on YouTube. Anyway, Dylan and Bob and George's plan worked. After that gig in February 1987, the Graffiti Man audience really grew, and people started turning out at their gigs in larger numbers, partly wondering if Bob Dylan will show up again, but also as sincere fans of Graffiti Man. It worked. It was a really cool gesture on Dylan's part. And if we know a little about Bob Dylan, that's not the kind of thing he does very often. Bob doesn't go into the media and say, I like this artist and you should listen to them. Or if he does, it's something from a long time ago. He doesn't really prop up contemporary artists very often. For him to do that, I think, says volumes about how much he loved Jesse and cared about him.
And one of the first pictures in the book is a picture I have on my classroom wall of Harrison, Dylan, Jesse, and John.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful picture, framed here.
Bob smiling,
Yeah,
which you
yeah.
don't see very often. George is not, as the photographer remembers, because George was embarrassed by his teeth. Embarrassed of his teeth. But it's a great photo. At that concert in '87, I put it in conversation with the Bangladesh concert from 1971 in the book. And I say everything's kind of turned on its head now. Now Jesse's not going out to New York, to Madison Square Garden to play with George and Bob. Those guys are coming to him now. And they're trying to lift him up when he was really unwell, really struggling with his health. And it's a beautiful scene in Jesse's story.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to thank Brian Cudian because he hooked me up with the video of that recently because I hadn't seen it.
It's a treat.
So it is a treat. I just want to you can sign books and all that.
Happy to, sure.
I wanted to just end on a note. I want to thank you for coming here all the way from Oklahoma. And thanks Tsunami Books. And also just say there's one thing that I've learned that I discovered. I've had one discovery in my life, and it has to do with biographies. And this is the only thing I've ever discovered myself on my own. And it was when I read all the John Lennon biographies, up to probably about 2005. I read all of them. And what I learned is that you find out a lot about the biographer when you read a biography.
Yep.
And you learn a lot about a biographer.
I learned a lot about myself.
Well, I was going to say, I was really excited, reading this book. I learned you're a really cool dude.